Jimmy Lai is defending himself against charges of colluding with foreign forces and a separate sedition charge as well. And the prosecution is arguing that he was trying to influence foreign governments, encourage them to put sanctions on Hong Kong. If he's found guilty, he could see a maximum sentence of life in prison. But of course, he is 77 years old, so his family and international legal team obviously fear that even a shorter sentence could see him live out the rest of his days in jail.
Yeah, he's testified in court today, as you mentioned in your story earlier. What else did he have to say?
Yeah, so he went through this graphic that was quite remarkable of all the various people he knows basically around the world, prominent people. They even talked about people like editors of newspapers, politicians. Obviously, Donald Trump was really the one that stuck out, but several UK politicians as well. Chris Patten, who was the last governor of Hong Kong. Lots of different people like that were gone through. In the afternoon, he sort of was drawn a bit more on what he thought of Donald Trump. He said that while he had never met Donald Trump, he never spoke to Donald Trump, even indirectly, he did think or hope, he said, that Donald Trump might have some influence to stop the implementation of the national security law, which is, of course, this wide-ranging law that's really quashed any protest movement, political freedoms, freedoms of speech here in Hong Kong. He said he had hoped that Donald Trump might have some influence to stop that. And while he sort of said that, he hadn't done anything directly, he did think that if they could stop the NSL, it would mean that political freedoms, particularly freedom of speech and an independent press, would be preserved. And he did make the comment that he feels his predictions were borne out by the events happening here today.
Now, he's also a British citizen, and I understand that the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer raised his concerns with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20 summit.
That's right. So the new Labor government in the UK has spoken about Jimmy Lai quite a bit. They've said it's a priority for their government. David Lammy raised it when he met with his Chinese counterpart recently, the UK Foreign Secretary. But then we saw, of course, earlier this week, Keir Starmer raise it when he had a meeting with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the G20 in Brazil. He said he was very concerned about the reports of Jimmy Lai's deteriorating health, and in a quite strange series of events at that stage, because he said it when the gathered press was still in the room. At that stage, Chinese officials kind of forced everyone, all those journalists, out of the room. So obviously these representations, both by Keir Starmer and by the comments by Donald Trump, have been encouraging for Mr Lai's son Sebastian, but also for the international legal team who are advocating on his behalf.
Sometimes people think that because we're dealing with China, that we should be despairing. It's too big an enemy. And I simply don't accept that. I mean, we've seen a number of cases recently of political prisoners, prisoners of conscience, being released after international pressure. Of course, we've seen Australian journalist Cheng Lai released after concerted, robust work by the Australian government to secure her release. We've also seen Pastor David Lin, an American, released in the last 2 months after Jake Sullivan travelled over to Beijing to raise the case. Canada secured the release of the two Michaels. We've also seen Ireland secure the release of businessman Richard O'Halloran. So speaking frankly, if Australia can do it, if the US can do it, if Canada can do it, and if Ireland can do it, the UK and the international community should be able to do the same for Jimmy Lai.
And Kathleen, what have you observed in Hong Kong? What's the mood there, given that this trial is effectively being seen as an attack on the democratic press?
Well, I guess the first thing to note is that the Apple Daily, Jimmy Lai's newspaper, no longer exists after he was arrested and the assets of the company frozen. So there is a smaller press sector here, although there are still a lot of international press, and the operation of journalism here is still different to that on mainland China. But there was a huge amount of interest, particularly from the press, in the events yesterday, the sentencing of 45 pro-democracy activists former lawmakers, academics for their roles in an unofficial primary. There were hundreds of people here who had turned out to see that event. There were probably about 100 people here today lining up in very unpleasant weather, I would say, to see Jimmy Lai give evidence. This trial has been delayed for months, so it was highly anticipated. A few people we spoke to saying that they really hoped that the international community would see that people still wanted support here, but there was only so much they could do here as Hong Kong citizens, that they wanted, the international community to do this advocacy work on behalf of Jimmy Lai. So there is still, I guess, a storm being weathered, but there are still people trying to advocate for the freedoms that Hong Kong was so well known for. But the one other thing I would mention is that in our time here in Hong Kong more generally, we've been working on other stories, and it's quite shocking or remarkable really seeing how scared people are talking about anything remotely political, not just pro-democracy stuff, not freedom of the press. We're doing stories on other issues that are quite, I would say, pedestrian and domestic, and people are fearful. They don't want to share their identities for things like that. So certainly there is a chill on people here, and they are worried about not knowing exactly what the red lines are now in Hong Kong under the national security law.
Yeah, a very different climate indeed. Kathleen Calderwood in Hong Kong, thanks very much for the update.
Thanks, Girish.